All right. Welcome, everyone. Last week we ran out of time. Um, we were giving a little introduction to Nazir last week. We were going over the Minchas, the Sefer HaChinuch, and discussing, right, the three prohibitions. Again, just to review, the prohibitions of a Nazir are tiglachas, the hair, the yayin, and tumul mesim. Okay. So there was one thing I wanted to get to last week regarding the haircut, because tuma we kind of understand, right? Wine we kind of understand, right? We brought in the Gemara that discussed that the sota is related to the Nazir because they're juxtaposed, right? They're juxtaposed in the Torah, they're juxtaposed in Seder Nashim, and but the whole haircut thing, we don't really have an understanding. So I saw a very beautiful Shlah Hakadosh, okay, in Parshas Naso that I wanted to start off. I wanted to read it inside. Very, very inspiring. He says the following: V'hinei nitztavel legadel seyar. Right, we know that the commandment, as we discussed by the Nazir, is to have him grow his hair long, him or her grow the hair long. V'achar kach b'mlos yimei nizra legaleach. And then at the end, you cut it all off. All right, so what do you have? You have basically two extremes. You have long hair for a point, and then right after that, you have no hair. So that's something that we have to keep in mind. So the Shlah says, Ki ein safek shehasar hagadol biyoter az hagiluach hagomur yafsid tower ben adam be'enu mevakesh taiva. He says it's absolutely clear that too much hair, right, excess hair, or being complete bald, right, they both make you lesser of appearance, meaning you don't look good either way, right? Sometimes you see people and their hair is too long and they're all disheveled, and you say, oh, he's a bum, right? And then the opposite, you don't look good either when you're bald. Obviously, if you're old and you lost your hair, that's a different story. But assuming that you intentionally take all your hair out, right, that's not good either. So we have basically two extremes over here. We have too much hair, and then we go to a period of having absolutely no hair, right? So he says, so he says, once you're in two stages, once where you're completely bald, or if you have too much hair, so they take away from his appearance. And what happens is, in being such a condition, that helps minimize our taiva level. We have less of an appetite to sin when we don't look as nice, right? Meaning we're not comfortable. There's something lacking. You're too much hair or you're too little hair. So that's what the point is. You want to get to a point where you don't want to sin. So, right? So when you have those two circumstances, right, it minimizes your taiva, right? And what's your taiva? Your taiva is obviously greed. You want too much, right? You're too high on yourself. So therefore, the Shlah says what you do, right, as opposed to when your hair is of normal kemptness, right, and you have enough hair and it's combed nicely. So once we have that, that reinforces our back to have human desires. And then he quotes the Gemara in Nazir, which if you have your Gemara at home, we had this a couple of days ago in the Daf, on Daf Daled, right? What did the Gemara say? Amar Shimon HaTzadik, right? A famous Gemara that everybody, well, not everyone knows, but if you're learning Nazir, this is like one of the top Gemaras in all of Nazir, because it talks about the ideal Nazir, right? What's the ideal Nazir? So Shimon HaTzadik says, Miyamai lo achalti asham Nazir tameh, right? I never ate the meat. Right? He was the Shimon HaTzadik, The Mishnah talks about it. He was in the Beis Hamikdash for a very, very long time, right? He was a Kohen, and he claims that he never partook in the korban that a Nazir Tameh brings, except one time. Okay, a Nazir from the south came to me, Ra'isi Yafe Einayim B'Tov Roi. He looked very nice. He had nice eyes, and his appearance was very well, right? The Gemara uses the word Roi, right? Roi means that anyone who looked at him became very entrenched, enthralled in him, right? He had like a magnetic appearance. That's what the word Roi means. Okay, and his hair was combed very nicely. So he says, what are you doing? Right now you're a Nazir, but why did you decide to destroy such beautiful hair? So Amar Li, right? So this is the Shlach quoting the Gemara in Nazir on Daf Dalet Amud Beis 4b on the bottom if you're following. Amar Li, so this Nazir said, Roa hayiti la'aba be'iri, I was a shepherd, and I happened to one day see my reflection, right? This is like the story of Narcissus a little bit, right? He saw his reflection in the water. I saw my reflection. I got all of a sudden hyped up, right? A little arrogant, right? And my Yitzhahara got to me, and I was a whisker away from doing bad stuff. Amarti lo. So after hearing the Shimon HaTzadik said, "Wow, I'm sorry." Amarti lo. So I told the Yitzhahara, Rosh lama tamiska ba'olam she'enu shalach. He said basically to himself, right? So you're deciding now to be bad, right? Because you saw yourself, you get all high in yourself and arrogant. So what? You're going to be the ruler now over a world that doesn't belong to you? You're just nothing. You're just dust in the wind. You're going to be nothing in the end. He says, I'm going to cut my hair because his hair is what brought him to this stage of gaiva. Right? The Stipler was known to say that most of our acts of sins that we commit all start with gaiva, meaning what? We think that we're high and mighty, we're arrogant. Because we're arrogant, we think such and such, and therefore we are quote unquote entitled, right? The entitlement effect. We're entitled to sin because our Yetzirah convinces us how great we are, how good looking, how rich, how this, how that, whatever adjective you want to fill in. If you feel that way about yourself, so there's an Indian of being, confident. That's okay. Every life coach will tell you, right? When you go to an interview or whatever you're doing, be confident. Don't be a schlep, don't be a nebuch, right? Always project and promote yourself. But there's a level of gaiva that you should never get to, right? And that's the basis, says the Stipler, of practically all of our sins that we do start with that. So that's why this Nazir says, here I am looking at myself. I'm getting all high and mighty. Let's go. Let's cut the hair off and become a real Nazir. Wow. So when Shimon HaTzadik heard this, he quotes the Gemara, Miyad amarati v'nashaktiv al rosho. I kissed him on his head, and I told him, Bini kamoscha yirbo no dre nazirus. You are the paradigm of what nazirus is all about, my son. And Alecha Kasuf Omer, this is what the pasuk means. And Naso ish kiyafli lindor neder nazir lahazir lahashem. Right? You are doing it, right? You are doing it for the ultimate reason, lahashem. So that's the story of Shimon HaTzadik, and this story is actually, if you remember, we had this way back in the first parak of Nidarim, about I'd say about 3 months ago, more or less, if you're keeping score at home. And the Ran over there, if you remember, commented the fact, again, what's he doing? He's not eating. Shimon HaTzadik basically admitted that this is like a real Nazir. So of course it's a real Nazir, I could partake in the korban. It sounds like that most Nazirim, I can't eat their korban. Why not? Because what is it now? Keep in mind the technicality over here. This is a Nazir Tameh. A Nazir Tameh, we're going to see later on in a couple of weeks that if you almost make it to your 30-day or 60-day or however long you decide to be a Nazir, and unfortunately you blow it at the end because you became Tameh or you cut your hair by accident, you have to count all over again. And the Ran explains that if you have to, let's say you did it for 100 days, right? It's like the Omer, right? You missed the last day of Omer. Okay, so according to the opinions that say the whole sphere is one mitzvah, you'd feel pretty crummy knowing that you are 2% away from doing the whole mitzvah, and you blew it because you forgot the last day to count, right? That's a pretty bad feeling. So it's almost like you regret doing the whole thing. Like, oh, why did I have this app that reminded me every night? And then the last day my battery died and I forgot to count Omer, right? You're all upset, almost like you regret. So that's the problem with a Nazir Tameh. A Nazir Tameh, although he may play the part of being happy at the end, the fact that he has to count all over again, he can't be too excited. So because he can't be too excited, the korban that he brings is not with a full heart. So that's why the Ran says, because he doesn't bring it wholeheartedly, it's like, oh, I got to bring this korban. I regret doing it. I probably shouldn't have become a Nazir. So he kind of puts into question whether that korban is a real korban l'shem shamayim, right? Because it comes with all these, coulda shouldas, and he's not too happy at the end. So that's the way the Ran explains the Gemara. So getting back to the hair, and again, this is what the Shla is saying. He's quoting this Gemara. He says, "V'zehu nezer elokav alav." That's what the pasuk means. The crown of God is on him. Klomar nichnas begeder adam harishon kodem shechata. This person, this Nazir, is in the category, believe it or not, of adam harishon, before the first, right? Before the original sin, right? What did Adam become? Kodem shechata shelo hayazar. Before Adam became this zar, this stranger, vaz hayanezer elokav bli shum emtsai, and that was when, before his sin, right? That's when he also wore that crown, and because Adam wore that crown, says the Shla, vaz hayanezer elokav bli shum emtsai, kamo hakohen shehutzrach l'shemen, v'zeh hanezer alav kol zman nizro aval v'kolos hazman v'yishuv lihiyos keshar b'nei Adam. But after a while, when you sin, when you do something, you become like, that's it, you become like an average Joe, right? It's only during your period of holiness where you have this crown. But once you take the crown off, you're just an ordinary person. So says the Shla at the end, that the crown is taken off. That's why you have to bring a korban at the end when it's all over, right? This is a little bit like the Ramban, right? If you remember, why did the Ramban, not to get into it now, we're going to see it in a couple of weeks, about whether the Nazir sins, whether he doesn't sin. So the famous Ramban says that, no, he's doing something very virtuous, as opposed to the Rambam who says, no, it's not good at all to be a Nazir. So everyone asks, so according to the Ramban, why do you bring a korban chatas? So the answer is because now he's going back into the world full of sin. So he's got to bring a chatas for the future sins that he does, which is a very, very controversial opinion about bringing a korban before you even sin. Okay, we'll talk about it hopefully in a couple of weeks. I got to save something for the middle. It's a little dry, the middle of Nazir, so I got to come up with some topics. So I don't want to ruin it now, but we'll see soon. But that's what the Shla says. He says after the crown is gone from your head, and the hair doesn't matter anymore. So now you are a regular Joe, and you have to bring your korban. Dugma shel adam harishon tzuhutzrach lekorban achar shechata. Just like he quotes the Gemara in Shabbos that says that Adam brought a korban, whatever that means. He brought a shor after his sin, and that's the reason why a korban is also brought by a Nazir, because he's back into the real world. He was in this like spiritual, right, into the spiritual, dreamland for 30 days. Now it's back to work in the real world, And now that's why he brings a korban. But it all starts out from this Gemara that he quotes about the power of the hair, and that when you have too much or you have too little, then you're in this state of flux, right? So that's why, that's why the Shlah says that this hair is such an important role for a Nazir. So I thought that was a very good start. And I heard a Vart a while back in the name of Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, who also asked a very interesting question, talking about the Nazir, right? He says that if you look at the psukim, right, we mentioned the haircut, the wine, regarding the tumah. So if you look in the psukim, it says that a Nazir can't go into an ohel hames, right? He can't defile himself by coming into contact with the dead, by touching it, by going in an ohel. And similarly, we have the same thing by a kohen, right? However, the difference between a Nazir is more like a kohen gadol, because what about one of the relatives of the Nazir? So the pasuk says he can't even attend the funeral of his brother, sister, right, his father, his mother, just like the kohen gadol. The kohen can, right? There are exceptions to the Zion Krovim of a regular kohen. He's allowed to be matama to them, but a Nazir can't. But says Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, if you look at the psukim, you don't find that the pasuk by a Nazir talks about the other two krovim, which are what? His son or daughter. By the Kohen, it says, La'avivu limo la'chosa, right? L'bno l'bito, right? U'lechav, right? The pasuk in Emor. That talks about his son or daughter. So why is it that the Nazir in Parshas Naso has no mention at all? Now we know through Torah Shabbal Peh that they're included, but why is it that the psukim don't talk about this son and a daughter, that if the Nazir unfortunately loses, he or she is not allowed to attend their funeral? So he says something extremely, extremely insightful. He says, if you examine the Nazir for a minute, what is the demographic of a Nazir, right? Based on this Gemara. Again, we don't have too many real life stories in the Gemara about actual Nazirs who made an appearance, but this person happened to be a young man, right? It says that he was a shepherd and he had a lot of hair and he was working for his father. So you could imagine he was probably a teenager or something like that. So says Rav Yaakov, if you analyze it, Nazirim weren't old, which is why Nazirim, chances are, did not have sons or daughters. So that's why the Torah doesn't mention the fact that you can't be metame to them, simply the fact that they didn't have sons or daughters. So the question is, why is the ideal Nazir someone without children? So he has a tremendous psychological insight into this, and I thought it was completely, mind-blowing when I heard it. He said, because what is a Nazir all about? A Nazir is all about a word that politicians love to use, change, right? Everybody talks about change. So you become a Nazir, like this person in our story. He became a Nazir because he had to change. He needed to change. Something happened in his life where he had one of those eureka moments, and he says, I got to change. I don't want to sin, right? So who is more likely to do that? A younger person or an older person? Well, we know that it's very difficult to change when you're older. When you're younger, you're still in school, you're still in college, you're still finding yourself, you're moving on and about, you're going to high school, you're here in Israel. I'm assuming, people in our, communities that we know of. And in your late teens or early 20s, you're looking, right, for the elixir of life. And you're willing to change and do things to set yourself up for the future. An older person in their 50s and 60s, good luck, right? Because after all, right? We know that the saying goes that people don't change. So I was thinking about that for a long time, and I said, well, is this one of those moments where we see this deep insight that we learn from this obscure-ish notion about a Nazir, that most Nazirim are young because it's much easier to change when you're younger than older. So I was thinking about it for a long time, and I saw this really, really interesting article I want to share with you. And it's written by two Harvard psychologists. Okay, their names, just open it up. Their names are Robert Keegan and Lisa Leahy. They actually wrote a book together on this theory called competing commitments. Okay, I just want to review it for a little bit because I was reading it and it made so much sense to me. So this is an article they wrote together for the Harvard Business Review in 2001. Okay, it's called The Real Reason People Won't Change. It's a psychological dynamic called a competing commitment. And until managers understand how it works and the ways to overcome it, they can't do a thing about change-resistant employees. So obviously it's used, in the business world, and how to manage and organize a company, and how to, manage people, workers, etc. He says, what's going on? As organizational psychologists, we have seen this dynamic literally hundreds of times, and our research and analysis have recently led us to a surprising yet deceptively simple conclusion. Resistance to change does not reflect opposition, nor is it merely a result of inertia. Instead, even as they hold a sincere commitment to change, many people are unwittingly applying productive energy toward a hidden competing commitment, meaning there's something blocking their ability to change. The resulting dynamic equilibrium stalls the effort in what looks like resistance, but is in fact a kind of personal immunity to change. So without sounding like this is a brisker hakira, it's basically a question of how to look at people who just are set in their ways, and no matter what. So I was thinking about it, even in terms of, let's say, tshuva, right? So the Rambam discusses that there's three aspects of tshuva. First, we have to actually hakaras haveira. We have to admit that we actually sinned, right? Which is itself a difficult thing for a lot of people, right? The fact that you actually admit that you're sin, you're already on the right path. So that's the first step. The second one is charata, that you actually don't just admit and realize that you sinned, you actually have to have charata. You have to regret that you did it. But the most important part is what we call Kabbalah al ha'asid, which is accepting for the future that if this were to ever come to happen to us again, that we wouldn't do it. And the Gemara in Yuma all the way at the end discusses, how do we actually do tshuva? And the Gemara says, well, if you sin, if you're in a certain situation and you sin, and then the same situation is presented to you 3 months later, and you don't do it, that is real tshuva. Now, this is very, very difficult, meaning it's okay, or I should say it's reasonable or logical that we could admit that we sin. It's likewise reasonable to regret that we sin. But the question is, do we really have Kabbalah al ha'asid? Do we really say, well, if this happens again, and, not to sound too cynical, but you know where I'm going with this, because the answer more often than not is not really, which is why we have say the same thing every Yom Kippur for all of our lives, because we say that we sinned and we're going to do better. And here we are a year later, and we're basically saying that we're sorry for the same sins that we've been doing for the last 75 years. So although we certainly try, but there's some kind of block in us that on the one hand, we admit that we sinned, we regret that we sinned, but I challenge you to change how I'm going to be. When we're younger, it's much more easier, like Yaakov Kamenetsky gleaned from this young Nazir, right? But when we're older and we're set in our ways, I see that it's much, much more difficult. there's a second article I found about this theory. By the way, he wrote a whole book. It's called Competing Commitments. Came out in 2008-9. It's actually available on Amazon if anyone's interested. So here's what they say. He says, Robert Keegan and Lisa Leahy wrote extensively on the topic of change, and more particularly on the immunity to change. Their approach is somewhat different than that of Deutschman. Okay, he was a different author who wrote something similar. Without disagreeing with the concept of creating a compelling vision, they focus on the individual's identity, i.e. his past experiences and behaviors, and the assumptions he makes when faced with a situation that challenges his status quo. Oh, this is a little bit like the Rambam. Like, yeah, I admit that I was bad and horrible and I did X, Y, and Z, but let's see what happens in the next situation. According to Keegan, the baggage we carry, more precisely called our biases, dictate our behaviors and attitudes even before we consciously decide to act. That's the key line. In other words, our biases hijack our intentions, thus resulting in a different outcome than we might have hoped for. He calls this a competing commitment, an underlying commitment of which we are not aware, which works against our stated goal. According to his findings, our brain develops an immune system, much like our body does. Its role is to protect the status quo in our lives, what we define as chazaka, right? We're used to acting a certain way, a certain behavior, so that's our chazaka, right? Good luck changing what we're used to doing all of our lives. The status quo, as we all know, is where we feel confident, knowledgeable, and understand what is expected of us. It is often referred to as our comfort zone. Change offers very little of that. Okay, so there's a whole therapy and a whole class. I'm not going to go into it, but he actually has a whole way of how you can teach old dogs new tricks. I don't want to get into it because then this turns more into some kind of plug, which I don't get any money from them. But I just found it extremely interesting how we have this concept that, that we see from this Nazir, and we're like, oh, let's think about that in our lives. And like, why are only Nazirim, like, why are most Nazirim young? Because, the Nazir, which is all about change, is much more difficult to do when you're older as opposed to when you're younger.
Bezalel?
Yes.
Can I just offer a competing interpretation of the book? I mean, now,
I couldn't say it any better.
I'm sure you got it right. But when you said competing commitments, I was thinking it's the same reason people in a particular shul that I'm familiar with don't go daven. They don't come to the minyan. It's the same reason. It's not only that they don't change, they don't daven either because they've got competing commitments. They've got children, they've got work, they've got all these other things. That's their immune system.
I thought you were going to talk about the Kiddush Club.
Sorry.
Oh, that's something else. Okay. Yeah, I hear you. It's just another example, but okay. Yeah.
I was sort of, I said, oh yeah, competing commitments. That's why people don't study. That's why people don't go to shul. That's all. It's all these other reasons. Same reason they don't become Nazirites.
Yes.
Same.
Yes. All right. Yeah. Well said. Well said. And on that note, I wanted to switch topics a little. Something more back. Yes.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
So it is Naziros looked at as, because Rabbi was talking about it, is it looked at as like, this is something that you should take on? Or is this something that is because you feel?
Is it a reaction, right? Is it proactive or reactive? I think that's what you're asking.
Yeah.
So therein lies the age-old question, and it's debated by, the stalwarts of our, of our religion, the Rambam, the Ramban. It's talked about in the Chinuch at length, and it's talked about in our Gemara even. We had one mention of Rabbi Lezer HaKaper, I believe, a few days ago on Daf Gimel or Daf Dalid, about how the Nazir is a sinning, and and then we extrapolate that to if you fast, right? If you decide to take a fast by yourself because you had a bad dream or because you lost a bet and you feel terrible and you're depressed, are we allowed to afflict ourselves? And like I said earlier, I don't want to talk too much about it. So you have to wait a couple of weeks. But yeah, it's, I mean, most rational people today would probably side with the Rambam, that it's something that it's not, because you're basically using it as like your fight or flight, like you have no other choice. So therefore I'm going to go extreme, right? I'm going to go do something that is completely off the charts, right? Not drinking wine. Obviously today it's okay, who drinks wine? But it was much more prevalent back then, or there was much more tumah back then. Today, okay, just avoid a cemetery. There were bodies, tumah was everywhere. And, so when you're depriving yourself, it's not a good thing. I mean, depriving in general, I mean, it reminds me of the end of the Yerushalmi, the very last Yerushalmi in Maseches Kedushin, says that eventually you're going to have to explain yourself to God when you're up there giving din v'cheshbon about all the great things that he put into this world and you didn't take advantage of, whether it's geographical, whether it's fruits, whether it's food, whatever it is, whatever you didn't take advantage of in this world, right? Like these, who was it? I think the Navardic Hasidim, right? That they would seclude themselves in the forest in the freezing cold, and they would hit themselves. Right? That's not what Judaism is about. Other, Buddhism or whatever other Asian, religions may be like that, but we're not into giving malchus to ourselves or whatever it is. We're here to enjoy and to get what God gives us. So if we have the privilege of having wine, right, which is the foundation of all simchas, right, and you decide to be a Nazir Shimshon or a Nazir La'olam, you're nuts. The Rambam says. He says you're not taking advantage of what's out there, right? That's why. So anyway, so that's a little bit of where this conversation goes.
Why? Two quick follow-ups. One is, if it's a reactive thing and the purpose is only to do it if you absolutely need to, are you still achieving maybe like a higher level of holiness through it or not?
I don't know. That in itself is also part of the debate.
Okay.
But you do bring a korban chatas. That's where this whole thing stems from. Is you don't bring a korban chatas for you can't donate a chatas because you didn't do anything wrong. A chatas is just for a chet. So there's something inherently bad about what you're doing. What that bad thing is a big humongous debate. But the bottom line is there something bad going on?
Okay.
So just steer clear of it.
Yeah. Well, then the natural question also, whenever talking about Nazir, is why the whole tractate then? Why are we spending so much time talking about Naziris if it's maybe supposed to be something that's not necessarily taken up?
Well, how about Nadarim? We spent 91 days learning Nadarim, and it was quoted 4 times in those 91 days that if you make a neder, it's like you're building a bama. And if you're Makayim the neder, as good as you think you are, it's as though you bought a carbon on the bama. That's a horrible thing. And yet we spent 91 long winter days on it.
Mm-hmm.
The answer is that because people do it. Don't hawk me about Tamura. That's a separate issue. Okay, we got to continue or else we won't finish. And then next week I'm going to start with what I didn't finish last week, and we'll have this cycle. Anyways, I wanted to talk about Daf Zayin. There's a Mishnah. I found Daf Zayin to be very fascinating because there's 2 very, very cool topics on a very obscure page, a very technical page, where it talks about the way you would describe yourself to be a Nazir, right? Like, so if you want to be a Nazir, the easy way is to say Hareini Nazir. But this person decided to say, I'm on 7a on the 4th line from the top, right by the new Mishnah. Amar Harini Nazir Achas Gedola, Harini Nazir Achas Ketana. Person said, I am a Nazir, a large Nazir. I'm a Nazir, a small Nazir. Afilu mikan vat sofa olam, even from here to the end of the world. Nazir shloshim yom. We learned already that the minimum installment to become a Nazir is 30 days, right? Meaning that's the backup. That's called Stam Naziris, right? The default, so to speak, number is 30, and the minimum number is 30. So even if you say, I'm going to be a Nazir to the end of the world, it sounds like, wow, you want to do this Nazir thing forever, right? The Mishnah says it's only 30 days. So the Gemara says, I don't get it. We're the Gemara now, the first line. Amai. You're telling me in the Mishnah what? That it's only 30 days, like a regular default 30 days for Nazir. But this guy wanted to, right, to have this Herculean Naziris from here to the end of the world. So Gemara says, well, I'll explain to you. Hachi Kamar. You know what the person meant in the Mishnah? The person meant, Aricha li hada milsa, kaman ve'ad sofa olam. He says that I'm willing to undertake this tremendous task like it is from here to the end of the world. All right, so what does that mean? So let's look in Tosfos. 1, 2, 3, the fourth. Now, just the Tosfos that appears in the Maseches Nazir is actually a friendly Tosfos. Sometimes we have Tosfos in other Masechtas that are very long and complicated, like in Ksuvas, and they ask lots of questions, and we usually end Tosfos with many more questions than we started. In Nazir, the role of Tosfos is more like Rashi, simply for the reason because Rashi doesn't exist in Maseches Nazir. The commentary you see on the right side that we just call Rashi is actually called the Mefarish. We don't know who he or she, saying that jokingly, was, but either way, it certainly wasn't Rashi. So Tosfos explains, the fourth Tosfos says, Perish v'lahave Nazir, this person should be a Nazir, la'olam, umeshani, and then the fourth Tosfos answers, this is what the Gemara means, Hachikamar, hareini, Klomer, arichali hamilsa, la'olam chad naziris kabel aleha, lakula. Really, even though he used this funny way of describing the kind of nazir that he wants to be, which sounds like a really super long time, Tosfos says no. We go lenient. We go minimum 30 days from him. Why? Dahachin mishtame tfei, because this makes more sense. De'im hu ratzalomer mikan vatsofa olam, because if this person really deep down wanted to be a Nazir for the rest of his life to the end of time, hayalo lahazkir minyan sofa olam. He should have been more specific and said, I want to be a Nazir for the rest of the world. What does that mean? Tosfos says, Diodeo hu shapir, because this person knows very well how big the world is. Because the world is a mahalach, right? You know the expression of mahalach, right? A long journey. The journey of the world is 500 years. So if this person really wanted to be an olam till the end of the world or the end of the universe, he should have said, I'm going to be a Nazir 500 years. Because after all, everybody knows that the world is 500 years long. So what does that mean? And Tosfos ends off by saying, he should have said 500 years. Therefore, we go lenient. Because he just said this term, he didn't mean it literally. He meant to be 30 days. If he really wanted to be a long-term Nazir forever and ever, he would have said 500. So it's interesting because the Tosfos says, Diodea hu shapir. This person deep down knows that what? That the world is really 500 years. So what Tosfos is referring to is a Gemara in Psachim, we'll see in a minute, that says that the circumference of the world, we know that the circumference of the world is a little bit less than 25,000 miles. Okay, it's 24,800 something. It's actually 18 miles wider around the equator than it is from pole to pole, because the globe is like they call it an obloid spheroid. It's like a beach ball that if you sit on it a little bit, it expands at the belly. So the circumference around is actually longer than it is the other way, I think by 18.5 miles. But in terms of the distance, Tosfos is under the impression that everybody knows that it takes 500 years to walk from one end of the world to the other. So that's not true, though, because if you look in the back of the Gemara, there's a very obscure perush on the Gemara written by the author of the Tosfos Yontiv. The name of the perush of the Tosfos Yontiv his name is Yom Tov Lippman. Okay, he lived, let me give you a quick bio. He lived in Poland. His name is Lippman Heller. Okay, he has actually two last names. Born 1579 to 1654. I personally saw his caver in Krakow. He's buried near the Ramashul in Krakow. When I went there, I saw it. He's buried next to the Bach, actually, the Bayis Chadash, Raviel Circus. He has a very, very massive parish on the Mishnayos. He has parish on Nazir for some reason. I'm not sure, but I'm actually not complaining, because he says something very interesting. It's very short. He says, look at the words of the Tosfos use. Tosfos uses the word because, after all, everyone knows, based on where you are, that the world is a 500-year journey to the end, if you were to decide to walk it. Says the Tosfos Yantiv, Tzarachiyun. What do you mean? The mikol makom mi yodea me'oso makom shuhu omed ad sofa olam kama. He says something that makes you scratch your head. His question is assuming that the world is flat, because he's saying that the world ends at some point. So Tosfos says, well, right, after all, you know that the world is 500 years of a walking journey. Says Tosfos Yontiv, that's not true. How do you know where you are, assuming everything is linear, right? Forget this concept of a globe that we know about. If everything is linear or square, then you start at A and you end at B. If you, like in the cartoon, if you lean over, when you're finished at point B, you fall off the world, right? That's the way Tosfos Yontiv at least thought of the world to be, because his question is, well, why is it 500 years? What if he lived in the midpoint? What if he lived 2/3 of the way down? Then he only had 166 years to go, right? We're assuming that you're all the way at the beginning. Then you have a 500-year journey. But if you're somewhere in the middle, you're not 500 years. But if the world is round and you all start back where you came from, then there's no end. There's only an end if we're talking linear. So I would think that based on Tosfos Yontiv, he thinks, now he lived at the end of the 1500s, so we didn't have Hubble telescopes and we didn't have pictures of the globe and we didn't know a lot of things, right? So I don't know if I blame him for thinking, right? I'm sure the Tosfos Yontiv did not travel to the Far East. He probably didn't visit the American Indians in North America, right? I'm sure he probably didn't leave Poland. So he only dealt with the Gemaras, he only dealt with what he had to deal with. But it's interesting how it sounds like that he actually thought, based on this Tosfos, based on his question, right? And he actually ends off his question by saying, I don't know what Tosfos is talking about. How could it be 500 years? Maybe he's somewhere in the middle, and it could be less than 500. So the question is, where does the Gemara get this concept of 500 years from? So for that, we have to go to a Gemara in Psachim. The Gemara in Psachim says the following. It's on page 94b toward the bottom. The topic of the 9th parak of Pesachim talks about Pesach Sheni, and it's somehow, without getting into the details, goes on an agadic tangent about the circumference of the world, all facts about the world. It says that if you decide to walk up to the heavens, it'll take you 500 years. And the Gemara goes on to say that the thickness of the rakia is a 500-year journey. And it says between each firmament, there's 6 or 7 levels. It's like the way the Gemara in Chagiga, if you remember, describes the world on top. It's like a 7-layer cake. There's different layers, and God is all the way on top. We don't know what that means. It's certainly not literally like a 7-layer cake. It's just something for us to think about what it means to us. Rashi over there says, just like the trip up is 500 years, Rashi in Pesachim says, "La'orko shel olam k'midas govo." The orech, the length of the world, is like the height. And it brings a pasuk, "Asher bara Elokim haaretz adam ala haaretz u'mitzeh hashamayim," whatever it is. So Rashi says that's how you know that if you decide to walk around the world, it'll take you 500 years. Now, people actually did walk around the world, but we're not going to talk about that now. We'll save that for another moment. But getting back to the point over here, that is where we get the number 500. So now you should be saying to yourself, okay, so Tosfos and Nazir seems to think the world is flat, right? We know that this concept of 500 that Tosfos brings and Nazir on Daf Zayin has his proof from the Gemara in Pesachim. So the question is, what about the rest of Chazal? Like, did we all think that the world was flat? So there's a Gemara I want to quote in Avodah Zarah. This particular Gemara is very near and dear to me. I used to learn this a lot with my grandfather. For some reason, I found it fascinating. My mother's father, that is, he showed me this Gemara when I was very little. It's on Daf Mem Aleph in Avodah Zarah. The Gemara over there is talking about statues, and the Gemara brings an opinion that certain statues, it's called Kol Hatzlamim, right? A statue is forbidden as an Avodah Zarah, assuming it's in a certain situation. So the Mishnah brings down, actually, the Gemara says that the Chachamim are of the opinion that a statue is only usher if the depiction in it is holding either a rod, a bird, or a ball. Okay, so the Gemara says, "Makel, I am on Avodah Zarah 41a." If you're following at home, on the 8th line from the top, Avodah Zarah Mem Aleph Amud Aleph. What's the problem with a statue that's holding a rod or a staff? Makel sharoda es atzmo tachas kol ha'olam kulo kamakel. Because the person with a staff is like a leader. So the idol is promoting itself as a leader because it's holding on to a stick, right? Like a leader, a shepherd, or whatever. So he's like kaviyachol leading the world. A bird, sipur shetofes es atzmo tachas kol ha'olam kulo k'tzipur. A bird, because a bird, right? When you're free as a bird, you have free reign, and like the world is your oyster. You can go wherever you want. So the bird signifies dominance over all. And the last one is a ball. So the Gemara says, what dominance do you show by a statue holding on to a kadur? So the Gemara says, kadur shetofes es atzmo tachas kol ha'olam kulo kekadur. Because you're showing that you grasp, that you have a hold on the whole world like a ball, like, right? You have the whole world in your hands, right? That expression. So what does kadur mean? So it says Tosfos, famous Tosfos, shaha'olam agul. The reason, if a statue is holding on to a ball represents a globe. And Tosfos says, in case you were wondering, the world is round. Right? This was probably written in the 11th century, 12th century, I'm guessing. That's when the Balei Tosfos lived. Maybe a little earlier. Shaha'olam agul, Ked'isa bi Yerushalmi. Tosfos brings down a Yerushalmi Alexandros Mukdam, Alexander the Great from Macedon, Ola Lamala went all the way up to the heavens, whatever that means. Ad Shara Kola Olam Kakadur. And he gazed down, right, like Superman, and he saw the whole world was round. That's Hayam Kikara. And the waters, the seas were like a kaira, were like a basin, were like a plate. Perish Yam Ukinus, the Atlantic Ocean. Shemakif es Kola Olam. In Tosfos's world 1,000 years ago, the Atlantic Ocean was all over the world, right? The oceans are all connected, right? I think it's 76% or 77% water. So all the oceans, the Atlantic turns into the Pacific by the Gulf of Mexico, and the Pacific turns into the Indian turns into the Arctic, and the Arctic turns into, right? All the four oceans are all interconnected. The Indian Ocean turns into the Atlantic Ocean again, right? It all goes round and round. So Tosfos says, yeah, it circles the globe because it's really one ocean. Okay, we call them different names now, but an amateur looking at it sees one ocean. So what Yerushalmi is Tosfos quoting over here? So thanks to Sefaria, I was able to find that Yerushalmi. And the Yerushalmi is in Avodah Zarah, obviously. Yerushalmi says exactly what the Bavli said, that the Chachamim say that it has to be a rod, a bird, or a ball, okay? And it says, Sheha'olam asoy kikadur, okay? The world is shaped like a globe. Amar Rabbi Yonah, Alexandros Macedon, right? Alexander the Macedonian, Kadba Mesak La'el, wanted to go up and see the world from on top. He went up and he rose and he saw the whole world was round. That's Hayam Kekaira, just like Tosfos said. No, don't go. That's Hayam Kekaira. And the bowl, right, and the water like a bowl. Begin Cain, Siren lay Bekadur Biyade. Therefore, one represents him with a globe in his hand. Okay, so that's what the Yerushalmi says. It sounds from here that there's really no debate, that at least the way Tosfos and Avodah Zarah learns is that it really is round. So I thought that was very, very interesting. I want to end off. We have 7 minutes left, because this is one discussion that this seemingly innocent or technical Gemara uses, and we learn a very dynamic discussion about world flat versus round. The Gemara later on goes on to say, if you skip a few lines, we're about 10 lines from the wide lines in the bottom. The Gemara is comparing a case where someone said, I am a Nazir forever. I'm a Nazir for 1,000 years. And I'm a Nazir like the hair on my head. Again, a person wants to become a Nazir for a long time. So he or she is thinking of a description, like how else would you, like the sands of the earth, right? Or something like stars in the sky. You want to really, really show how long you want to be a Nazir for, so that's what you talk about. So the Gemara says, well, we have two different cases. One case is where he says hair, and the other case is where he says, dust of the earth. So the Gemara says, Rabba Amar, we're about 8 lines up. Rabba says, Shiny Sa'iros Hol Muvdola Zumizu. The reason why there's a difference between one who accepts being a Nazir based on the distance between two places, like I'm going to be a Nazir from here to the end of the world, and one who accepts being a Nazir based on the numbers of hair on his head. Both are very, very long distances, but the difference is because the hair on your head is separated from each other. So yes, you have a lot of hair together, but in fact, each hair has one root. You don't have many hairs from one root. So therefore, because they're all separated, that's why you could be a Nazir for longer, right? So if one says, like the hair in my head, he's saying, I'm going to be a Nazir, and if they count the hair and he has, 200 hairs in his head, then he has to do 200 terms or 200 months. That's a long time, right? That's 200 times 30 is 6,000 days of becoming a Nazir. But the Gemara says, hold on a second, but what about days? As long as it takes me to walk around the world. The days also, Gemara says, Gabe Yom Anami, in regard to days, doesn't it say Vayihier Vayihiboka Yom Echad? In Bereshis, and what does that mean? It indicates that each day is also separate. I have Monday, I have Tuesday, I have Wednesday. So if it takes me 10 years to walk from New York to Florida, so therefore I should be a Nazir for however many days. If it's 10 years, that's 3,000 days. So 3,000 times 30, I should be a Nazir for 90,000 days or whatever it is. Why do we separate the hair? But in terms of day and Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, we don't separate it. So the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. Hasam lav the mifsake mahadadehu. The answer is because there, the Torah says that days are separate. It doesn't mean that the days are separated from each other, because they're really not. Monday turns into Tuesday in a second. Tuesday turns into Wednesday. As Einstein says, right, that the time is really continuous and never stops. Rather, what the person is saying, that it's the period of day and night happens to be one calendar day, but actually days are not separated from each other. Okay, they go on a calendar, you'll see 7 boxes for 7 days of the week, but technically one day goes into the next. And there's a very famous Maratz Chayas on this line. Again, an innocent line. The Gemara is just trying to technically make a distinction between hair on your head and days of the week. And in doing so, the Maratz Chayas, right, 19th century Vilna, right, comes off and says, wow, here's what he says. Yoma v'layla chad yoma v'lo mifsekum. Day and night are one and are one time continuum. Nichtav b'tzida, says the Maratz Chayes, v'hainu b'bchinat kol hakador kulo tamid erev uboker. You know what the Gemara is referring to? The Gemara is referring to time zones, right? And the date line. It starts somewhere and it ends somewhere else. He says, it's not that day turns into night. Like, yeah, if you stay up all night, when it's 11:59, then it's 12 o'clock and it's another day. No, not for you. He's saying, looking at it objectively, he says, in terms of the whole globe, it's right. The sun is always rising every second and the sun is always setting every second. It just depends where you are. If you're halfway equidistant around the world and you're separated by 12 hours, so it's 6 a.m. for you, the sun is rising, but it's 6 p.m. for someone else on the other side. So what sunrise for you is sunset for someone else. He says, it's always night and it's always day. Without a separation. It's night for half of the world, in the Western Hemisphere, let's say. Uboker, in the Eastern Hemisphere, it's morning. The question is, where do we mark off that difference? Meaning it has to start somewhere. So we picked in 1884 that it's going to run through Kiribati, right near Vanuatu in the Pacific Islands. Okay, that's what we decided. Chazon Ish, not to get into it now, but you see where this is going. We don't have time to talk about it, but here he alludes to the fact that it has to start and stop somewhere. So I found that interesting. The way the world goes around and around, al panei kol haaretz b'chaf daled shaot shekol rega mehem boker b'makom hazeh erev b'makom shekenegdo. That's what the Gemara says. Time is continuous, not for you, for the whole world. What's light in one place is dark in another place. There is no night and day difference depending on where you are in the world. It's all blended. It depends what your perspective is. That's what the Gemara means when it's differentiating between the hair on your head and Monday and Tuesday. Hair on your head, each hair has its own separate root. So therefore I could count one from a different one. But when it comes to days, it's all mixed. It all depends where you happen to be situated on planet Earth. The kol rega v'rega hu or b'choshech yachad v'zeh emes, and this is emes. And on that note, it's 9 o'clock exactly. So I wanted to show that on one page on Mesachas Nazir that seemingly talks about mundane items, such as how long I want to be a Nazir for, or if I say I want to be a Nazir like the hair on my head, things that we would just dismiss as pure academic. We see beautiful stuff relating to, as Tosfos says, the circumference of the world, or as the Maharatz Chaya says, the concept that it's always light and it's always dark, and time zones and date lines, and great things emerge from seemingly mundane items. And on that note, I wish you farewell.
Shkach.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
By the way,
Anytime. Yes.
you know, and you have the coronation. I think I remember seeing when, there's been a lot of publicity about Queen Elizabeth passing away. When in her coronation, part of the coronation is they have an orb that they hold.
Yes.
The staff, and then there's the orb.
Yes. And I did find pictures of Alexander the Great online holding onto a globe, holding onto a sphere, just to fulfill this Gemara in Avodah Zarah.
It's really fascinating. Thank you for bringing.
No problem.
Thank
All
you.
right. Onward and upward.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.